Hey guys, so for this one we're going to be talking about the lives of African Americans in the Antebellum South from a time period roughly 1800 to 1860. Here are your goals. Pay attention to these. Alright, so let's begin by looking at the lives of an often understudied group of people, the free African Americans in the South. So by 1860, there were 250,000 free African Americans living in the South. And these guys were usually either freed by their owners or else they actually saved up money and bought their freedom. And oftentimes these guys could be the mixed-race children of white owners and black slaves, which would frequently be freed by the white owner, but not always. And so most free African Americans were small farmers, but some did very well for themselves as entrepreneurs. In New Orleans, there was a large, thriving culture for free African Americans, and a few free African Americans actually even became slave owners. One famous example is William T. Johnson, who was a successful entrepreneur working as a barber in Mississippi, who eventually bought a few slaves. Which seems kind of weird, but it shows that these racial divisions between white slave owners and African American slaves is not always 100% solid. Okay, so these guys, even though they did have certain rights and they were free, they were treated as second-class citizens. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to testify in court against white people. So that meant that if a white person did something terrible to them, they would not be able to charge that guy in court with a crime. They wouldn't be able to testify and say what he had done. Also, these guys were at risk of being kidnapped and sold into slavery. So you had to always be careful because you never knew if maybe one day your child would be abducted and sold down onto a plantation in Mississippi or something like that. Alright, but so the free African Americans were a small exception to the rule in the South, and that is that African Americans were almost always enslaved. So slavery had spread very rapidly in the South because of the cotton gin, and you can see that the growth in population is quite striking. In 1800, there were 1 million slaves in the South, but by 1860, there were about 4 million slaves in the South. And if you look at that map there, you can see how slavery spread over time. The top map is from 1790, and you can see that slavery was really just concentrated in a few, like a small pocket up around the Chesapeake Bay, and then down on the coast of South Carolina. But by 1860, slavery had spread throughout the South, especially spreading to areas of South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana in an area known as the Cotton Belt, or sometimes also known as the Black Belt, because in certain areas, African Americans were the majority by a long shot. In some of those areas down in Alabama and Mississippi, they were almost 75% of the population. Okay, so how did this rapid growth in slavery occur? Well, first of all, the African slave trade, where people would be purchased or captured over in Africa and brought to the United States, was made illegal in 1808. And this greatly cut down on the import of enslaved African Americans. But smuggling still continued, and it usually went unpunished in the South. So that meant that illegal shipments of African slaves were still going on. But the main source of growth of slavery was actually from natural population growth through the reproduction of enslaved African Americans who already lived in the South. Families and children were usually encouraged on plantations because if you were a slave owner and your slaves had children, those children would also become slaves, and this would increase your wealth as a slave owner. Some plantations went so far to encourage children that they actually began offering freedom to women who gave birth at least 10 times. As I already mentioned, slavery spread to new areas, the Cotton Belt of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Louisiana. And what this meant is that as slavery spread westward, many African American families were split up as some members were sold to new areas and other members remained in the old areas. One consequence of this is that Virginia, which was one of the leading slave-owning states at the beginning of this period, actually began specializing in slave breeding, where they would raise a large number of slaves and sell some of them down to the Cotton Belt. So let's now look at what it was like to be a slave. What characterized life as an enslaved African American? It's actually really hard to generalize, and the reason for this is that conditions of life varied depending on where you lived and on what the person who owned you was like. And so, of course, some slave owners were sadistic and monstrous and tortured or raped their slaves. But some owners were kind and treated their slaves well, making sure that they were well looked after and healthy. But of course, most slave owners were probably somewhere in the middle of these two extremes, using violence at times to force their slaves to work or to punish them, but also looking after them because purchasing a slave was very expensive and they were treated as an investment, and you would take care of this thing that you had purchased. So what we can say for certain is this, is that life as a slave meant hard work, no education, and no political rights. Education was sometimes even made illegal because Southern whites thought that educated slaves would be harder to control because then they would be able to communicate via writing, and they would be able to resist more effectively their status. And secondly, there was no legal protection. So if an owner decided to mistreat you, let's say that he wrongfully punishes you for something that you didn't do, you would have no protection and you would have no right to testify against him in court. And finally, there were no legal marriages. Marriage between two enslaved African Americans was not recognized. So this meant that even if you were married and even if you lived with the same person for 20 years, you could be split apart and sold to different plantations at a moment's notice. Let's look a little bit more at work and punishment. So it's important to realize that slaves were usually protected and treated as an investment by their owners because they were extremely valuable. As we mentioned in the last class, investment in slaves and land was the two main ways that rich Southerners used their money. And so a healthy adult slave was worth $1,800 in 1860, which is equivalent to about $51,000 today. So an extremely costly investment. And what this meant, one, is that the most dangerous jobs were usually done by poor whites. This is stuff like blasting tunnels for mines or railroads, and also construction. These jobs would be done by poor whites who would be hired to come onto a plantation or a farm, because if they died, the slave owner wouldn't lose anything. But on the other hand, if they had one of their slaves doing this work and it died, they could lose an investment of almost $50,000. So most slaves were field workers. They worked in crews on the fields from dawn to dusk, usually in cotton fields, but also in other crops like tobacco or rice or sugarcane. And so these field workers were overseen by drivers, people who basically made sure they kept working. And these drivers were sometimes white, but they were also sometimes black. Sometimes they were even slaves, very well trusted enslaved people who were basically charged with making sure that other people, the other slaves, keep working. A large number of enslaved black women worked as maids and nannies for white families, and this would usually mean that you would have a less strenuous life than working out in the fields, but you would still have a lot of work and you would be charged with caring for the children of a white family. But so One of the negative aspects of life as a slave was the harsh punishments that you could be subjected to by your owner. As mentioned before, there was no protection for you if your owner decided to punish you. And if you did not follow instructions, didn't work hard enough, or broke any rules, you could face sometimes extreme punishments. Whipping was the normal form of punishment, and the whip became a symbol of the authority of the slave owner. But there were also crueler punishments, including iron masks and bits, or even separation from your family. Now let's take a moment to look at the unique American culture that developed among enslaved African Americans. First of all, family life among enslaved African Americans was actually quite strong. And so in spite of the constant threat of forced separation, or also of abusive owners, most enslaved African Americans were able to grow up in stable families. And even though the marriages weren't legal, they were still very common. And one kind of touching thing about these marriages is that their vow went, instead of "until death do us part," "until death or distance do us part," recognizing the fact that they could be sold and separated at any time. A unique form of Christianity also developed among enslaved African Americans. So Christianity was spread to enslaved African Americans during the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s. But after it was spread, certain aspects were emphasized more in enslaved African American culture. There was a heavy emphasis on the Israelites' escape from Egypt, and also on Christ as a returning redeemer, somebody who would come and save people from their fallen state. There was also a unique style of call and response preaching drawn from traditional African songs and dances. And this is still visible in many African American churches today. And finally, and perhaps most important for American culture on the whole, were the innovations in music brought about by that occurred in slave culture. So first of all, what happened a lot when people were working in the fields was they would sing work songs to help pass the time. And also singing was an important part of African American Christianity. And these songs go on to influence gospel music. And there also were a number of other unique African traditions that were kept alive by African Americans, including banjos, which were an African instrument, and unique African rhythms. And these instruments and rhythms go on to influence blues, jazz, R&B, and rock and roll. And so basically, if it wasn't for African Americans, American music as we know it today would not exist. We'd be stuck with basically boring classical music. And so it's these innovations that really go on to influence American music in the 19th and 20th centuries. All right, here are your goals again. I'm sorry this video was a little bit long, but hopefully you found it interesting.